May 24th, 1940. The entire British Expeditionary Force, over 300,000 men, stands trapped on a beach in northern France. Behind them, the English Channel. Before them, the most powerful military machine the world has ever seen. Adolf Hitler's armies have accomplished in 6 weeks what the Kaiser's forces couldn't achieve in 4 years. France is collapsing. Belgium has surrendered. The road to total European domination lies wide open. And then, Hitler gives an order that will haunt him for the rest of his life. An order that would save the British Army. An order that would cost him the war. This is the story of the single greatest mistake of World War II. From WW2 Camp. History remembers the great turning points, D-Day, Stalingrad, Midway. But there are moments less celebrated, decisions made in the heat of confusion that alter the course of human civilization. Moments where victory slips through the fingers of those who seem unstoppable. The spring of 1940 was Hitler's supreme moment of triumph. In this documentary, we'll examine not just what happened on the beaches of Dunkirk, but why the fate of the free world came down to 72 hours of chaos, courage, and catastrophic miscalculation. To understand how close Hitler came to absolute victory, we must first understand how completely he had already won. September 1st, 1939. Germany invades Poland, and the world descends into war. But this is not the static trench warfare of 1914. This is something new, something terrifying. Blitzkrieg, lightning war. The German military has developed a doctrine that combines air power, mechanized armor, and rapid infantry advances into a devastating combined arms assault. Where the armies of World War I moved at the pace of marching men, Hitler's Wehrmacht moves at the speed of internal combustion. Poland falls in 27 days. The world watches in stunned silence as a nation of 35 million people is crushed beneath the German war machine with almost casual efficiency. Then comes the phony war. Through the winter of 1939 and into early 1940, the Western Front sits quiet. France and Britain declare war on Germany, but launch no major offensives. Behind the concrete fortifications of the Maginot Line, French commanders convince themselves they are safe. They remember the Great War. They believe modern warfare still means trenches and attrition. They're catastrophically wrong. May 10th, 1940. At dawn, German forces launch Fall Gelb, Case Yellow. The invasion of the West begins. But Hitler's generals don't attack where the French expect. While Allied forces rush north to defend Belgium, the main German thrust comes through the Ardennes forest, terrain the French high command has deemed impassable for tanks. It is not impassable. On May 13th, German armor reaches the Meuse River at Sedan, the same location where France was humiliated in 1870. History, it seems, has a dark sense of irony. General Heinz Guderian's panzer divisions smash through French defenses with textbook precision. The French Ninth Army collapses. Within 48 hours, German tanks have torn a 50-mile gap in the Allied front line. And they don't stop. They race west toward the Channel coast. By May 20th, German forces reach the Channel at Abbeville. The Allied armies are cut in half. To the south, the bulk of French forces, reeling and disorganized. To the north, the British Expeditionary Force, the Belgian Army, and elements of the French First Army. Nearly 400,000 men total. Trapped. What follows is chaos on an almost incomprehensible scale. Roads throughout Belgium and northern France become clogged with civilians fleeing the German advance. Millions of people, many having already fled once from the invaders of 1914, now flee again with whatever they can carry. German Stukas dive from the sky, machine-gunning refugee columns to create maximum panic and block military movement. It is psychological warfare perfected. The British Expeditionary Force, Britain's only professional army, begins fighting a desperate retreat toward the coast. These aren't conscripts. These are the trained regulars, the backbone of British military power. If they're lost, Britain has virtually no land forces to defend against invasion. Lord Gort, commanding the BEF, realizes the terrible truth before most of the Allied leadership. France is finished. The only question now is whether the British Army can be saved. On May 23rd, British forces begin falling back on the port of Dunkirk. It's a small channel town, surrounded by canals and marshland, with a harbor far too small for what's about to be asked of it. Behind them, German panzer divisions race to cut off any escape. The 1st and 2nd Panzer Divisions are already within 15 miles of Dunkirk. The trap is nearly sprung. And then, something inexplicable happens. May 24th, 1940. 11:42 a.m. General Oberall Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of Army Group A, orders his advancing panzer divisions to halt, to stop their advance and consolidate their positions. Hours later, Adolf Hitler personally visits von Rundstedt's headquarters, and Hitler confirms the order. The panzers will not advance on Dunkirk. For the next 48 hours, as the British Expeditionary Force streams toward the coast in desperation, the tanks that could destroy them sit idle. It is one of the most debated decisions in military history. Why? The true answer may never be fully known. Multiple factors, multiple voices, multiple miscalculations converging in a single catastrophic moment. Von Rundstedt later claimed he was concerned about the marshy terrain around Dunkirk, unsuitable for armor. He had already lost half his tanks to mechanical failure and combat damage during the lightning advance. He wanted to preserve his panzer divisions for the coming battle to finish off France. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, assured Hitler that his aircraft alone could annihilate the trapped British forces. "Leave it to the Luftwaffe," he boasted. Göring craved the glory. Hitler, a veteran of World War I, may have remembered the slaughter in Flanders and wanted to spare his army from fighting in similar terrain. Some historians suggest Hitler harbored a strange hope that Britain might still negotiate peace if he didn't humiliate them too completely. Others argue he simply didn't grasp what was at stake, that destroying the BEF would leave Britain defenseless. Whatever the reason, the order stands. The panzers hold position, and on the beaches of Dunkirk, 300,000 men await either salvation or annihilation. May 26, 1940. The British Admiralty launches Operation Dynamo. The goal: evacuate the British Expeditionary Force before the German noose tightens completely. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, operating from underground headquarters beneath Dover Castle, coordinates what seems like an impossible task. The Royal Navy possesses nothing close to enough transport ships. Dunkirk's harbor is under constant bombardment. The approaches are mined. The Admiralty estimates they might, at best, rescue 30,000 men before the evacuation becomes untenable. They need a miracle. What they get is something more powerful: ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. The call goes out across southeastern England. Any vessel capable of crossing the Channel is requested to assist. What arrives is a fleet unlike any in history. Fishing trawlers from Scottish ports, pleasure yachts from wealthy estates, Thames barges, lifeboats, ferry boats. One vessel, the Medway Queen, would make 7 trips across the Channel, rescuing 7,000 men while shooting down 3 German aircraft. Many are sailed by their civilian owners, dentists and fishermen, lawyers and dock workers. They cross 22 miles of open water, often under fire, to reach the beaches. On the beaches, the situation borders on apocalyptic. Thousands of men stand in lines stretching into the surf, waiting hours for their turn to board. German artillery pounds the beaches. Luftwaffe bombers sweep in on constant runs. But Hitler's decision to rely on air power alone proves to be a fatal miscalculation. The Royal Air Force, operating from bases in southern England, contests every inch of sky above Dunkirk. Spitfires and Hurricanes engage in furious dogfights with German bombers and fighters. The soldiers on the beaches often can't see these battles happening at altitude and above the clouds. Many believe the RAF has abandoned them. In reality, Fighter Command is suffering devastating losses protecting the evacuation. But they're winning. German bombers find that hitting moving targets on a beach is extraordinarily difficult. The soft sand absorbs much of the explosive force from bombs. Men spread out, take cover. Casualties are lighter than they should be given the intensity of the bombardment. The breakthrough comes at the East Mole, a narrow wooden breakwater never designed for ship docking. Destroyers and transports begin tying up alongside it, allowing hundreds of men to board at once instead of wading out to small boats. The evacuation accelerates. 5,000 men on May 27th, 17,000 on May 28th, 47,000 on May 29th, and still the panzers sit idle. May 26th, 1940. Hitler finally rescinds the halt order. The panzers begin advancing again toward Dunkirk, but they've lost 2 critical days. British and French forces have used that time to establish a defensive perimeter around the port. At Kassel, a small garrison of British troops fights a desperate delaying action, holding out for days against overwhelming odds. At the Bergsferns Canal, French soldiers man defensive positions with grim determination. Every hour bought is another 1,000 men evacuated. The German advance, when it comes, runs into fiercer resistance than expected. The trapped Allied soldiers fight with the desperation of men who know they're buying time with their lives. By the time German forces begin seriously pressing Dunkirk's perimeter, over 200,000 men have already been taken off. June 1st, 1940. The evacuation enters its final phase. French forces have held the southern and western approaches while the British evacuated. Now it's their turn. Ships begin loading French soldiers as quickly as British. The perimeter continues to contract. German artillery fire intensifies. Buildings throughout Dunkirk burn. The sky is perpetually dark with smoke. June 3rd, 1940. The last British troops evacuate. Admiral Wakewalker makes a final sweep of the beaches in a motor torpedo boat, calling out for any remaining soldiers. June 4th, 1940. The last French troops depart. At 3:40 a.m., the final vessel leaves Dunkirk harbor. By dawn, German troops enter the town. They find it burning and abandoned. They capture thousands of French soldiers who remain to hold the perimeter to the end, along with massive amounts of abandoned equipment. But the men, the irreplaceable trained soldiers, are gone. June 4th, 1940. Winston Churchill addresses the House of Commons. He is careful not to call Dunkirk a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations, he states clearly. But he recognizes what has been saved. 338,000 men, 200,000 British, 138,000 French and Belgian have been pulled from certain destruction. Britain's professional army survives. Battered, exhausted, having left behind virtually all its heavy equipment, but alive. These men will form the core of the forces that eventually return to France on D-Day, for years later. The Royal Navy lost 6 destroyers sunk, 19 damaged. The RAF lost 106 aircraft. 243 ships and boats were sunk or damaged. Thousands of French soldiers were captured. But compared to what might have been the complete destruction of Britain's military capacity, it is a miracle. So why did Hitler's decision doom the Third Reich? In the immediate aftermath, it might not seem obvious. France surrenders on June 22, 1940. Hitler stands triumphant across virtually all of Western Europe. But Britain fights on, and Britain can only fight on because it still has an army. The soldiers saved at Dunkirk become the experienced corps that trains the massive conscript forces Britain raises over the next years. They staff the North African campaigns. They form the backbone of the forces that land in Italy and Normandy. More critically, Britain's continued resistance keeps a hostile power on Germany's western flank. Hitler can never fully commit his forces to the Eastern Front because he must garrison Western Europe against British attack. Britain's survival means the RAF continues operating. British bombers begin strategic bombing campaigns against German industry. American forces eventually have a base from which to launch the invasion of Europe. If the BEF had been destroyed at Dunkirk, Churchill's government might well have fallen. Britain might have been forced to seek terms. The entire strategic calculus of World War II changes. Without Britain fighting on, there is no Eastern Front that can count on a Western Second Front. There is no platform for American intervention in Europe. The atomic bomb, when developed, might have been used very differently. All of this stems from 72 hours when Hitler's panzers sat idle while the British army slipped through his fingers. German commanders understood their mistake quickly. General Gunther von Kluge allegedly said, "We could have wiped them out at Dunkirk." Guderian, whose panzers were halted just as they reached striking distance, was furious. He knew what had been lost. Hitler himself never publicly acknowledged the error. But as the war ground on, as British troops appeared in North Africa, Italy, and finally France again, the weight of his decision must have become clear. Some historians argue that even with the destruction of the BEF, Britain would have fought on. Perhaps. But without an army, without the capacity for offensive operations, how effectively? For how long? We'll never know, because Hitler gave the British their army back. Beyond the grand strategy and the tactical decisions, Dunkirk is ultimately a story about human beings under impossible pressure. The soldiers who held the perimeter knowing they were the last. The civilian boat owners who crossed the channel into a war zone. The RAF pilots who flew sortie after sortie until exhaustion or death claimed them. The naval crews who made trip after trip despite the bombs and shells. Many of the soldiers evacuated from Dunkirk never spoke about it. The trauma of those 9 days, the confusion, the fear, the terrible knowledge that many of their comrades were left behind, it marked them permanently. The French soldiers who held the line so the British could evacuate first often felt abandoned. It created bitter feelings that complicated Anglo-French relations for decades afterward. 35,000 French soldiers were captured at Dunkirk, most of them from the rearguard. They spent the rest of the war in prisoner camps. Their sacrifice is often overlooked in British accounts that celebrate the miracle of Dunkirk. Over the decades, Dunkirk has been mythologized. The spirit of Dunkirk, civilian heroism, national unity in the face of disaster, has become a cornerstone of British national identity. The reality is more complex and more human. There was heroism, certainly, extraordinary heroism, but there was also panic. Discipline sometimes broke down. Some men tried to force their way onto boats. Some officers had to restore order at gunpoint. The evacuation was a military disaster that could have been a catastrophe. It was turned into a success by a combination of German errors, Allied sacrifice, and desperate improvisational courage. But at its core, the legend isn't wrong. When faced with annihilation, tens of thousands of ordinary people did extraordinary things. They looked at impossible odds and said, "We'll try anyway." That spirit, the refusal to accept defeat even in the darkest moment, may have been what saved not just an army, but the possibility of freedom in Europe. Today, Dunkirk is quiet. The beaches where armies waited under fire are now visited by tourists. The mole where destroyers loaded desperate men has been rebuilt. Memorials that the landscape, British, French, Belgian, each remembering their own sacrifice, their own loss. In military colleges, the halt order is still studied as a case study in the fog of war. How even the most powerful military machine can stumble when leadership loses clarity of purpose. For the British, Dunkirk represents something paradoxical, a defeat that became a victory, a disaster that became an inspiration. The moment when everything seemed lost, but survival was snatched from the jaws of destruction. When Allied forces landed on D-Day, many of the officers leading them had been evacuated from Dunkirk 4 years earlier. They had lived. They had learned. They had returned. Wars are decided by countless factors: resources, technology, leadership, morale, geography. But sometimes they turn on single decisions made in moments of uncertainty. Hitler stood 15 miles from ending British resistance. 15 miles from removing his last adversary in Western Europe. 15 miles from fundamentally altering the strategic balance of World War II. And he stopped, not because he was defeated, not because he lacked the capability, but because in that moment, he and his commanders misjudged what was possible and what was necessary. 300,000 men slipped through his fingers and across the channel. And in doing so, they carried with them the future of the free world. Hitler almost won World War II at Dunkirk. Almost. But in war, as in life, almost doesn't count.